We're going to bring up our next two authors together for a joint presentation. DC Jesse Burkhardt and Scott Sparling have been close friends for more than 40 years, and they've always been fascinated by trains. They grew up in Michigan and started hanging around the railroad tracks when they were in high school. Before long, they were hopping freight trains across Michigan and eventually all across the country and Canada. Sometimes alone, sometimes together. They were two freight riders who became two freight writers. And by chance, they both ended up in Oregon. That's good, thank you. Jesse writes nonfiction. His stories of hopping trains and being on the road are captured in his travel adventures, which include Travelogue from an Unruly Youth, which won second place in the Washington Press Association Awards for Best Nonfiction Books for 2008, and The CROWBAR Hotel by Freight Train Across Canada. Scott writes fiction. He wrote about trains, northern Michigan, and drugs in his novels Wire to Wire, which recently won a Michigan Notable Book Award. So please, everybody, welcome DC Jesse Burkhardt and Scott Sparling.
Tried talking to this mic. I'm not used to doing that. Yeah, we wanted to do something different tonight. Scott and I grew up in Michigan, Jackson, Michigan. And Jackson, for those of you who may know, Jackson is considered the birthplace of the Republican Party, and it was also home to a state prison. So in junior high, we started hanging out together and started going down the railroad tracks because we were bored in Jackson, and the tracks represented a way out, something different, going somewhere else. We rode freight together for the first time when we were 16. We started out just grabbing onto ladders on the trains going by slow. And then, the thrill was there. We wanted to keep it going. We started going to other towns and other states, finally into Canada. It was just dangerous and thrilling, and we wanted to stick with that. So after high school, we started going around. After high school, started traveling all around, going into Canada, traveling together. And I personally logged about 37,000 miles riding freight trains around the continent. It's hard to believe now, but Scott was with me for about half of it. Back then he was known as Spider, the Spider Rider.
And just one thing so you know, this was all Jesse's idea. We would hang out in the tracks. I really wasn't doing that because of trains or anything. It was a place where there were no adults. And when you're in high school, what do you want? It's someplace where the adults will leave you alone. And but Jesse wanted to hop on, so I did that too, and I really learned how to do it from him. My name was Spider because I could climb, and your name was?
Iron Legs, because we walked all the time. So what I was doing, I took extensive journals when I was traveling because there's way too much going on to remember it. There's no way I could have written these books on memory, but decades later, after traveling all over, I started writing nonfiction travel adventures. Started out with Travelogue from an Unruly Youth, and that was about a time when I was following my passion for riding freight trains and trying to figure out if I wanted to be in a relationship because the two didn't go together, and I was having trouble figuring out what I wanted to do. A couple years after that, I wrote CROWBAR Hotel, which is about our experiences in Canada. When Scott and I and Marie, the woman who would later become my wife, we were trying to ride freight trains across Canada, but we ran into a big problem. We kept getting caught. The Canadian railroad police were very sharp, and we could not evade them. They were just everywhere. We thought it'd be easy in Canada because we had so much good luck riding in the U.S., but it didn't work out that way. And anyway, after time on that trip, getting caught just became a joke to us, and we turned it into a narrative. We're going to read that in a few minutes. But I want to read a passage first from the CROWBAR Hotel, which I think represents the mystery of riding freights, why we got into it, and the powerful sense of freedom we felt. So in this sequence, Spider and I are in a railroad town in Ontario, a small town. We're trying to get it to a station down the line called Oba, and where there's an interchange with the north-south railroad because we were trying to ride into Michigan. So let me see if I can read this. So a few hours after dark, 2 eastbound freights came into the rail yard that stretched out below us, pausing to take on fresh crews. Spider watched with me from the hillside. There was no indication that one train or the other might be more likely to stop at Oba. The trains appeared similar. Yet we knew that some of the trains operating over Canadian National's transcontinental line, linking Vancouver and Montreal, had to pause at Oba to interchange freight cars. We wanted to ask a worker if one of the trains would be stopping at Oba, but at the risk of being caught again, we opted not to dawdle. The soles of our boots thudded against steel rungs as we climbed into the shadows of one of the trains, settling for the second level of an empty in a tri-level auto carrier. It would be a ride open to the Canadian breezes, but we had no alternative. We needed hiding shelter, and as far as we could see, virtually everything else on both trains appeared to be boxcars sealed tight. At 1:05 a.m., our chosen train left the switching yard. The freight crawled away from the settlement. I was overcome with a whine of our apparent victory. We had eluded capture by the rail police, who scant hours earlier had threatened us with deportation if they'd caught us again. To hell with deportation, I jubilantly shouted to Spider, my voice rising above the slow squealing of steel wheels on steel rails. Feeling boundless, I climbed up the softly swaying auto-rack ladder from the second level to the top level as the train gained momentum for its eastward run. I put my back on the cool steel floor and opened my senses to the sky and stars. The view and the rocking sensation of the accelerating train turned overwhelming. Soon, Spider came up to the top level, wondering why I hadn't come back. Curious to know what I discovered. That was what I had hoped for. Like climbing down from the Moose Jaw Trestle and jogging alongside the Winnipeg grain train days before, the clear purity of the stars over North America was something to be shared. The Canadian night wrapped us in an entrancing spell. The northern lights glowed so brightly that beams from green spotlights appeared to be dancing across the sky, illuminating the atmosphere vividly. There are no city lights anywhere to diminish the visual impact of the electric carpet of the stars.
So I'm going to read a little bit. Actually, first I'm going to pass around a couple of pictures. You know, one thing I think about as I think back on that time, it's totally different. Is that you didn't document everything in pictures, right, the way you do these days. There are very few pictures. Jessica and I rode thousands of miles all across the country, and there are very few pictures. The two we have were taken by Marie on the maybe the one trip where all three of us were together. And so you can get a little sense of what you like. This one is taken in Alaska, and then another we're actually trying to ride across Canada, and we've been kicked out, and so we are just sitting in the dirt drinking beer. But go ahead and pass them around. Just to amplify a little bit, when we were growing up, you know, we lived about 2 streets away from each other, outside of town. Not much to do. Typical Saturday or a big Saturday adventure for us would be we'd get both cars. I had an old '60 Valiant. You had a old Corvair. Both, you know, hand-me-downs from our parents, and we'd drive both cars to the freight yard in this town where we lived, and we'd leave my car there. And then we get in Jesse's car. We drive about 20 miles out of town to a siding where Jesse said a train would stop. And we'd sit there, and you know, you'd wait all 4 or 5 hours, and you'd do what teenage, you know, kids did. We just talked and wait, and pretty soon a train would come. We'd hop on that train, ride it the 20 miles downtown to the freight yard, and because trains go slow through town, that took a while. We'd get my car, we'd drive back out to pick up Jesse's car, I'd come home, so I'm gone like from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. on a Saturday. My parents say, where you been? I say, with Jesse. They say, do you have fun? I say, yeah. And that was it, you know, like no texting, none of the stuff that we would do today. And that's sort of how we, that was our gateway drug, really, to riding the freights together. You know, when we talk about it, people often ask, was it dangerous? Did you get caught? And we're going to talk about getting caught a lot in the story that we will read. And, you know, was it dangerous? I never thought it was dangerous. I never did. For one thing, we had rules that Jesse made up. For instance, if you're hopping a freight car ladder, you always hop the forward ladder, so if you miss it, you fall into the side of the car, not between the cars. I remember one of the times we were in a freight yard at night, and a lot of it is getting information. It's sort of an information trick to find out when the train is leaving and where it's going. You have to ask people, but asking people is a good way to get caught, so it's a little game. And I remember I was going to ask somebody, and he said, well, take your gloves off, because you're going up to somebody in the dark and you want them to see your bare hands and know that you're a good guy. One of the other rules was we never messed around on top of the cars. Years later, after we stopped riding, my mom sent me a clipping of some kids in our hometown. They'd gone out to the freight yard just after they'd been out drinking, and they were kind of having a party on top of this freight car, and it started moving, and I guess they thought that was fun. It was dark, and there was a low-hanging power line, and it hit one of the kids, and according to this article, the line took off his head. And I thought, how gruesome that is. And I just saved it and put it away. And about 20 years later, when I started to write Wire to Wire, I remembered that story. And I thought, okay, that's how my story is going to start. And the guy's not going to die. So in my story, there's a guy up on top of a freight car. He's trying to light a joint, but he doesn't have any matches, and he's kind of, patting around his pockets for matches and looking down. At the last minute he looks up, he sees this line coming, tries to duck, almost makes it, but the electricity arcs over, hits him, lights the joint for him. And after that, he suffers, it's happened to all of us at one time or another, I'm sure. And after that, he hallucinates. And so he's the character. The other thing I wanted to write about was northern Michigan, because people think of Michigan, they think of Detroit, and in northern Michigan it's such a beautiful place. And one thing that's beautiful about it is they have these huge car ferries, railroad ferries, that can take an entire train across Lake Michigan. They split the train into like 4 sections, push it onto this ferry, get it all the way from Michigan to Wisconsin. And I remember the first time I was up there with Jesse, I'd seen these things. And I told him, they take passengers too. And he said, yeah, but I'll bet you that's like $100 or more. And I happen to know it was 13. And I always wish I'd said, okay, yeah, I'll go get you a ticket, just give me the money. But so I wanted to write about Michigan. I wanted to write about trains. I'll read you a little bit, very short section about the main character who's just hopping a train, trying to ride over the Mississippi River. A railroad bridge rose over the Mississippi River near the town of Winona. It was an elaborate structure with steel trestles and wrought iron trusswork spanning a full mile across the river, tying Minnesota to Wisconsin. Near the top of the span was a wooden bridge tender's shack, a cabin up in the trusses where, in the old days, an operator would sit with nothing but a radio and a flask of whiskey, watching miles of open river. The shack was abandoned now, the bridge automated. On the Minnesota side of the river, Harp stood watching an eastbound freight approach in the dark. The train coming at him, the one that would carry him across the river, was a Green Bay and Western, the Snake, it was called. It curved across Wisconsin to the edge of Lake Michigan. From there, the freight cars would be loaded into a giant ferry, the Chief Tecumseh, a mammoth ship that carried whole trains in its belly. When the headlight hit him, Harp raised a gloved hand. The engineer waved back. Quickly, Harp spotted a Milwaukee Road boxcar open on both sides. He jogged even with the train, putting a gloved hand on its side to feel its speed. The freight cars slipped past until the open boxcar caught up to him. And as it drew alongside, he threw his backpack into the car, grabbed the door frame with his right hand, and leaped. His eyes saw nothing. It was all by feel. His legs swinging up as far as he could hoist them, he rolled in easily and got to his feet. And as the train crossed the Mississippi, the ironwork of the spans flashed past, cutting the river into frames. He hoped the freight would get him all the way back to Michigan, back to Lane, the woman he loved, who was waiting for him. But on the Wisconsin side of the river, the train surprised him by taking a switch. Instead of rolling east, it swung onto the southbound tracks of the Burlington Northern, carrying him away from Michigan, away from Lane, and into Iowa instead. Clear of the bridge, the freight began picking up speed. There was little time to sort things out. Harp grabbed his pack and crouched by the door, searching for a spot to jump, looking for switches that might snap an ankle or bust his head, but darkness hid everything in shadow. And even as he tensed to jump, part of him thought how he had never ridden the southbound rails. Iowa was full of railroad towns he had never seen. He hesitated a second or two longer, then stepped back from the door, letting the moment pass, letting the train decide where he would go. Lane could wait a few more days. It was the right thing to do, he was certain of it. In another minute, the southbound was rolling fast, heading into the night and the dark mystery of Iowa, and the song of the wheels was ride. Ride, past scrap heaps and factories and beaten bums waving, past the end of towns, through empty fields and junkyards, past everything man has made and the things man could never make, eventually past light. At night, Harp stood in the boxcar and a halo rode the train, low above the engine, while landscapes turned amber, half-finished, pristine, and never glimpsed again. In Minnesota, moons veered from safe trajectories and the brightest lights of cities blew past like sparks from a half-smoked joint. I'll light it, you light it, let me light it. The air warm like Lane's body, ride in a soft cloth sleeping bag if you can, if they don't detrain you, or ditch you, or spot you at sidings, or kick you over the hump, ride. Then wake in the darkness with the clatter song loud, a stream of words launched from a sling, all tearing past at once. And from the deep part of the night, one word rings clear, one word, an inscription, ride. So that's the main character, trying to get home to the woman he loves and deciding it'd be more fun to ride freight trains instead. Not from real life at all. What are you reading next? Are you reading Don?
Yeah, I can read that.
One thing about my story illustrates is that freights were great as long as you didn't care where you were going. If you were trying to get to point A to point B at a certain time, it was terrible. But the thing that it's a different way of traveling, and what it teaches you is you let the train decide. The train decides when you get on, the train decides when you get off, and the train decides where you go. And when we were traveling across Canada, in a little town of Don, we realized that again. So go ahead.
Right, we were traveling from Vancouver Island basically all the way to Toronto and open to going on to Quebec and Montreal. But as it turned out, Scott had another commitment and the train was running and I was kind of hoping that the train wouldn't slow down so he couldn't get out, we could just keep going because it was so fun to ride, so adventurous. So a piggyback train announced its departure with a hiss and a pull and we moved, climbing aboard a flat car in the deep fog, staying low as the freight cleared the yard and slipped to the outskirts of the city. Spider had his Canadian National Railway map unfolded, and we were searching for a station sign to indicate where we were going. The train was moving too fast for it to matter for a time. We wouldn't have been able to get off anyway, no matter what the map told us. But soon the freight slowed, and we rumbled past a siding telling us we'd reached Don. In the narrowed beam of my flashlight, Spider traced his finger along the various routes branching out of Toronto until he found Don on the map. It was due east of Toronto, when we had been hopeful to go west. As usual, the train was taking us toward an unidentified destination. But at least it was a ride, and it was still dark. I was tempted to stick with the train regardless of the direction it was headed. If nothing else, it offered some security and relatively dry place to wait out in the blackness. I began trying to sell Spider on the potential of going on as far as it carried us, even if that was all the way to Quebec. We had never seriously discussed going beyond Toronto, but as the train moved along, the unexpected prospect of continuing eastward to further unknowns set my heartbeat racing. And even when I knew Spider wanted to get off the train, my secret hope was that the slowing eastbounder would pick up speed, the chance to drop over the side and back to the earth would be gone, and we'd have no choice but to soldier on. Instead, the train slowed to a crawl near a misty interchange junction a few miles east of Toronto. Don would be a closing. After Don, we would no longer be pursuing the mystery of an unseen region of Canada, but essentially turning for home and entering the gravity of familiarity.
Yeah, and so because we got off at Don, my entire life has been better. Because what happened was we were trying to ride from basically Vancouver, BC, all the way to Montreal. We were trying to get all the way across Canada by freight train, and we didn't, you know, and we thought we were pros. We'd done all this in the States, so we had like 3 weeks, and it just took forever because we kept getting caught. And I had told my girlfriend, don't worry, I will meet you in Traverse City, Michigan on 4th of July. And okay, no cell phones, no texting, no, this is back when there's no way to, once you're on the road, you're on the road. And so on the 3rd of July, maybe the 2nd, I don't know, we're in Toronto. And you know, my girlfriend's already in Traverse City waiting for me, and we were on this, I think we were on a piggyback car, which is a flat car that has a truck on top, you know, like a big freight truck on top of it, hiding under the wheels. And the sensible thing to do would have been to get off immediately and go to Traverse City. But Jesse keeps saying, no, let's go. Let's see where this train is going. And then he makes this deal with me, which is, if it's going east, away from Traverse City, you can hop off. And then maybe it'll take you west to Traverse City. And, you know, like an imbecile, I said, okay. And it starts going away, and it stops at dawn, and I get off, despite what Jesse wants me to do, and I meet my girlfriend in Traverse City, and we've been married since 1990. So, you know, I just shudder to think what would happen if the train hadn't stopped. Probably wouldn't be here. Anyway, together we have one more short thing to read, and I think it's pretty fun. It's a short story about, or an essay about trying to ride across Canada. That's yours. That's why it doesn't work. We didn't have much to brag about on our transcontinental freight trip across Canada. We wanted to hop trains all the way from Vancouver to Montreal. We wanted to sculpt through freight yards, write our names on the sides of boxcars, grab the grab irons, hop the hot shots, and just generally make railroad history. The problem was, we kept getting caught. So we had to get whatever mileage we could from our other exploits. In postcards to our girlfriends back in the States, for example, we wrote of sleeping in Tojojo National Park amid, quote, the sounds of Alberta midnight. But in reality, Tojojo consisted of 2 picnic tables 100 yards from the highway, where we had spent the day trying to hitchhike after the police had chased us from a train. The nearby cement factory provided the sounds of Alberta midnight, and even the magical sounding Tojojo was only the town's postal code.
So just for context, we're reading this together. We actually collaborated on this story and wrote it together, adding in our own points of view on different things. Originally, we'd intended to ride Canadian National's trains north from Kamloops to Jasper and Edmonton. But we've been caught in the CN switching yard at Kamloops by a railroad security cop, and we were forced to abandon that plan. Our alternative train on parallel Canadian Pacific track pulled out of Kamloops on a more southerly course than we'd fancied, bound for Calgary. Hour after hour, we climbed the Canadian Rockies. The wheels of our flat car were a quartet of high-pitched tuning forks, blending and overlapping at a volume just below painful. In the tunnels, the music became pure energy, power wine bouncing off the close walls as we hauled cutting through the mountain. At midnight, we saw the lights of Calgary approaching, and we reveled in the fact that we were there riding a Canadian freight. But it all ended in Calgary, 400 glorious miles from Kamloops. The locomotives cut off from the train and went away somewhere to refuel. We were left temporarily stranded in a dark freight yard. We figured the engine would be back soon, however. Our train was an express to Winnipeg. It would take a couple hours, however, so we knew we should hide somewhere until a train crew came back with engines. Instead, worn down by constant travel, we put our heads under our sleeping bags, each hoping that the other would suggest hiding, but also hoping against it because it was so good to rest. Our dreams were peaceful. We were warm and comfortable. It was a calm paradise. All we could ask for was to once again feel the smooth, lulling movement of the train, and we knew that would come momentarily. Okay, fellas, come off of there. Come on, get off this side, very slowly.
We jerked awake to see 2 Canadian Pacific Railroad policemen. Quickly, they kicked us off the train, and they spread our gear across the ground. Flashlights tracked our every movement. You got any watts on you, they asked? You carrying any revolvers? They squeezed the contents of our pack searching for who knows what. You could get 2 months or $100 fine for riding this train, the younger policeman said. Then, addressing his partner, he added, "No revolvers, constable." Satisfied that we were not criminals, their tone shifted, but not very much. "What the hell do you think you're doing riding up there?" the constable demanded. "Well, we wanted to see Canada." "See Canada? You won't see much from the CROWBAR Hotel. I could show you a picture of a guy in 12 pieces who thought freight trains were safe." And so it started, the way it did all across Canada. The predictable ride to the edge of the freight yard, the inevitable directions to the highway, the warning not to come back. At 3 a.m. we found ourselves on the streets of Calgary, taking sips from a bottle of Kahlua as we walked aimlessly, wondering which direction we should go. Then came another voice. "Can we see some ID?" We looked up to see a Calgary police car. We weren't even in the freight yard and they caught us again. "What do you got there?" one of them said, eyeing the Kahlua. "Well, it looks like a bottle." "It is a bottle." "Is it open?" $50 fine. But the Kahlua at least made a good impression. "That's pretty good stuff you're drinking," said one of the cops. "How much that set you back?"
Meanwhile, the contents of our backpacks were again being spread out and roughly squeezed in an endless search for weapons, especially ubiquitous revolvers, and a new dialogue started. "Okay, you first," the older cop pointed. "Up against the car. Stand still. You got any revolvers on you? Empty out your pockets. Nice knife. You can't get these up here. How much it set you back? Pretty nice little pocket clock you got there. How much that set you back? We're looking for a guy named Brewster. Supposed to be headed this way. He killed a woman in Oregon. You know him?" We said we didn't. And then again came the predictable ride to a youth hostel, the interchangeable small talk, interrupted by a startling question. "Man to man now," the officer behind the wheel says as he drives through the dark and nearly empty streets. "Do you want to sell me your knife?" At daylight, we put out our thumbs in the direction of Moose Jaw, planning to try our luck at catching a freight train once we, hopeful a new province would bring better fortune. We finally reached Moose Jaw an hour after midnight. Our brush with CP police remained fresh in our minds, and probably fresh in police computer banks. So we backtracked, backed off, and sidestepped the Canadian Pacific Railway Station, taking a roundabout route to get from a hiding gully on the eastern end of the freight yard to the crew change point at the western end. By this time, an eastbound freight had pulled in. All we had to do was get to it unseen and find a place to ride. And for once, we did it just right, really slick. An overpass carried automobiles over the yard of the west end, so we went for the shadows underneath. Posing as hitchhikers, we strolled along the roadway until the last possible instant before bolting under the bridge to invisibility. The freight yard stretched out before us. "This is great," we agreed. "Hell, it's probably the first place they'll look," we joked, proud of ourselves. We'd moved like seasoned pros, smooth, prudent, confident, conservative. We were feeling cocky. Unimaginably, within 30 seconds, we were again caught. "Okay, fellas, come on down from there."
This is the last section. You still got that knife?
I do.
Want to sell it? Okay, fellas, come on down. "You two could get 3 months in the slammer for this," one of the Canadian Pacific policemen said. "Well, at least the slammer would sound better than the CROWBAR Hotel on our postcards home." "Hey, send some money, man. We're in the slammer." "You could get deported, too," the other cop added. Our eyes widened at that one. We could hear how our friends back home would react. "What are you guys doing back here? I thought you were going to spend the summer riding freight trains in Canada." "Oh yeah, we were, but they deported us, man." We could head home without shame if they deported us. Instead, we ended up in the worst possible place, the bus station. The bus. We'd hit rock bottom, the absolute low point on what we had begun to call the Get Out tour. Get out of that boxcar. Get out your ID. Get out your wallets. Get yourself some bus tickets and get out of town. Somehow we managed to tough it out. Well, what else could we do? Eventually, our bus lumbered in, spewing exhaust. We got on board, found seats, fought for elbow room, and started composing our next postcards home. Thanks a lot. The questions will both be in the freight yard after.